Section 14 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Chapter 7, Psychophysical Equilibrium. The lack of a satisfactory condition of psychophysical equilibrium in all human activities is one of the most striking manifestations of imperfect functioning of the organism. The present faulty subconscious use of the psychophysical mechanism in our educational and other spheres makes for the gradual increase of this condition of defective equilibrium. It would seem that this fact is generally taken for granted, seeing that we expect defective equilibrium at a certain age, just as we expect the development of a flabby and protruding abdomen. This is surely the end of our contention that practice makes perfect. It also seems evident from this that there must be something wrong with the practice in the act of walking. The fact is that people walk without any clear understanding of the guiding and controlling orders which command the satisfactory coordination and adjustment of the psychophysical mechanism in the act of walking. Hence, when one or more defects become present in the functioning of these mechanisms, even though the persons concerned may be aware of their cause or causes, they are incapable of establishing once more that standard of reliable sensory appreciation which would enable them to eradicate these defects. This needs a process of re-education on a general basis, which will restore satisfactory functioning throughout the organism, and so ensure a continued raising of the standard of psychophysical equilibrium right on through life. In what follows, I shall endeavor to show that with almost every attempt to correct some supposed or real psychophysical imperfection, new defects are developed which tend to lower the standard of psychophysical equilibrium. In this connection, it is an interesting but very unfortunate fact that this unsatisfactory condition develops in the subject hand in hand with the desire to hurry unduly, this being a subconscious endeavor to compensate for the growing lack of equilibrium and lack of control. In extreme cases of lack of equilibrium, this manifestation is most pronounced. The subject becomes conscious first of a weakness or difficulty which affects his general equilibrium in walking, and without making any attempt to discover the cause or causes of this newly recognized weakness or difficulty, proceeds, as he would put it, to try to walk properly, i.e., to walk without the slight unsteadiness of which he is conscious. But the fact that this weakness or difficulty has developed is proof that the subject's guiding sensations and general psychophysical coordinations of the organism are defective. It is therefore obvious that any subconsciously directed efforts on his part to quote-unquote walk properly, i.e. more steadily, will be carried out according to the same defective guiding sensations and imperfectly coordinated mechanisms, and cannot therefore succeed. It must be remembered that during all these quote-unquote trial and error experiences, the fear reflexes are being unduly excited by the fear of falling, and by the general unreliability and uncertainty of the psychophysical processes which are employed during such subconsciously directed efforts. Taking this process as a whole, we shall find that most harmful psychophysical conditions will be developed, which soon manifest themselves in other spheres of psychophysical functioning, and very often culminate at last in some serious crisis. It is easy to trace the development of this lack of equilibrium in what is usually considered the purely physical sphere. Let us take by way of illustration the case of a boy who, in the ordinary way, would be classed as a good walker. We will assume that he has been injured at the age of, say, 13 by being thrown from a horse or by a fall downstairs, or has met with some other accident which has necessitated his being treated by a doctor and being confined to his bed for some time. It is obvious that his injury and the cessation of his ordinary activities will produce in the patient a more or less weakened condition generally, and also definite specific difficulties in connection with the injured parts of the organism. The result is that at the psychological moment when the patient makes the first attempt to resume walking, certain impeding factors will manifest themselves, which he will immediately proceed to overcome by trying to walk properly as he understands it. His attempt to walk properly must necessarily be on the subconscious plan of trial and error, for it is almost certain that he has never known how he walked, never had the least idea of the guiding orders concerned with the coordinations essential to the act of walking and to the development of satisfactory equilibrium. Footnote: my reader will probably think of the case of some friend who has made an attempt to walk properly after an injury and who is now walking about to his own satisfaction. My point is that the subject is not capable of judging whether his use of his psychophysical mechanisms in walking is satisfactory or not. It is quite certain that anyone with an expert knowledge in this connection could point to certain harmful defects in the subject's use of himself, which are the combined result of the injury, the varied experiences in treatment and recovery, and the attempts to walk, all of which are indicative of comparative weakness, a sense of interference with equilibrium, and a general loss of control. End of footnote. It will be necessary here to analyze the psychophysical processes involved in his effort, for success in such efforts demands quite a high standard of coordinated functioning of the organism. Experience has proved to us that this standard of functioning is not at the command of a person who has been through the experiences connected with such an injury, and with the subsequent treatment and gradual recovery to the point when what we call the convalescent stage has been reached. Real success is practically impossible, and for the reasons which follow. These attempts to walk would be made at a time when the subject was conscious of a weakness throughout the whole organism, of a comparative loss of control, of an interference with the psychophysical equilibrium, of a lack of confidence, together with a whole series of hopes and fears in regard to what he will or will not be able to do, associated again with fears which have their origin in the pain which results from his incorrect subconscious attempts to use parts that have been injured. This whole combination of psychophysical conditions constitutes a set of experiences which are new as compared with those present at the time of the accident. Each subconscious attempt to walk awakens consciousness of shortcomings, of strange and often alarming sensations, and tends to increase the real difficulties, viz., those concerned with that correct use of the psychophysical organism in general, upon which walking properly depends. It will thus be clear that the attempt to walk properly by subconscious guidance would merely be an attempt to revert to the habit or habits established in the act of walking before the accident. This way of walking was instinctive, and a particular instinctive process is the result of certain psychophysical conditions operating, as we say, by instinct. Change those conditions quickly, and you interfere with the reliability of the working of the particular instinct. This illustration furnishes us with a splendid practical instance of a definite need calling for new experiences in psychophysical use. The boy wishes to walk. The stimulus to do so produces an immediate response involving the processes concerned with subconscious guidance and control, which are habitual, but which depend for efficiency upon a given standard of coordinated functioning of the organism. Unfortunately, this standard has been lowered by his experiences associated with the accident, and the psychophysical machinery does not work as satisfactorily as before. In fact, in the majority of cases, it works very unsatisfactorily. The subject is able to compare the result of his present efforts with those he made before his injury. They compare very badly, and he is conscious of the fact. This merely causes him to try harder, as he would put it, to walk properly, and on a subconscious basis he has no alternative but to continue the unintelligent method of trial and error. We will now outline the experiences which the procedure based on the principles of re-education on a conscious general basis would have ensured in the foregoing case. In the first place, we should not allow the subject to try to walk properly until he had been given, by expert manipulation, correct experiences in the general use of the psychophysical mechanisms, and had become well acquainted with the correct guiding and controlling orders which would assist in the securing of the means whereby he should use the mechanisms in any attempt to walk properly. The recognition of weakness or difficulty would be the signal for an examination of the psychophysical mechanisms involved in the use of the organism as a whole, which in turn would enable us to note the defects and peculiarities in the use of these mechanisms in the specific act of walking. The technique we advocate would demand in practice that the subject would cease to try to improve his walking. We would therefore endeavor to convince him by demonstration that his efforts to improve his walking by muddling through by instinct are not only futile but quite absurd. By the same process, demonstration, he would be shown that as soon as he receives the stimulus to walk, he must begin his remedial work by employing his inhibitory powers to prevent the use of the wrong subconscious guidance and direction associated with his conception of walking. In this connection, it is explained to him that it is the use of the incorrect subconscious guiding orders to the mechanisms concerned with the act of walking, associated with unreliable sensory appreciation, which has caused the mechanisms to be used imperfectly, resulting in the weakness and difficulties with which we are contending. When the subject is more or less familiar with these inhibitory experiences, we go on to give him a knowledge of the new and correct directive and guiding orders, which, with the aid of manipulation, are to bring about the satisfactory use of the mechanisms in a sitting, prone, or other position. These experiences must be repeated until the new and reliable sensory appreciation becomes established, by which time there will have taken place an actual change in the use of the psychophysical mechanisms of the organism in general, making for a satisfactory condition of coordination and adjustment. When the required improvement in the general coordinations and adjustments has been secured, the processes we have outlined will be more or less in conscious operation, and a corresponding improvement in equilibrium in walking will be the result. The reader must understand that the details involved in such processes, differing as these do in each case, cannot be set forth here, and that moreover from the very first lessons the teacher's aim would be to cause the pupil to be conscious of what he should and should not do, and to give such help to the pupil as would enable him to begin at once to apply the principles involved not only to his attempts at walking, but more or less to all the acts of his daily life. In other words, the pupil is not taught to perform certain new exercises or to assume new postures for a given time each day, whilst continuing to use his faulty mechanisms and unreliable guiding sensations in his old way during his other activities, but he is shown how he may at once check, more or less, the faulty use of the mechanisms in the general activities of his daily life. An increase in lack of equilibrium in what is called the physical sphere will be found in every case to go hand in hand with a corresponding lack of equilibrium in the so-called mental spheres, and in any consideration of mental and physical phenomena, it must be remembered that in our present stage of evolution on the subconscious plane, the response to any stimulus or stimuli is at least 75% subconscious response, chiefly feeling, as against 25% any other response, this estimate of the ratio of subconscious response being probably too low. When these facts are fully realized by all those who are interested in education and in the conduct of life generally, there may be some chance of the realization of those commendable ideals for the uplifting of mankind cherished by leaders in the social, religious, and political spheres. End of section 14. Section 15 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Sensory Appreciation in its Relation to Man's Needs. Chapter 1. Quote-unquote, Knowing Oneself. Those who give thought to the present trend of human endeavor in political, social, industrial, and other spheres will recognize that our times are out of joint, and many of them will admit that the masses living in this disjointed time are more or less out of communication with their reasoning. In the midst of this unrest and uncertainty, the individuals composing the masses are struggling blindly for their individual betterment, without any clear understanding of the cause or causes of their difficulties, or of the fundamental principles which constitute in application the satisfactory means whereby these difficulties may be prevented or overcome. Man, know thyself is an old axiom, but in my opinion the more fundamental one is man, know thy needs. Of course, it may be contended that he who knows himself knows his needs, and that to know one's needs implies knowing oneself. But the contention does not apply to that great majority of human beings whose sensory appreciation is unreliable. We have seen that reliable sensory appreciation is essential to that coordinated psychophysical growth and development of the individual, which is fundamental to the satisfactory psychophysical growth and development of the mass, and this being so, in order to secure this growth and development of the mass, it is essential to command the means whereby of recognizing and supplying the real needs of the individual. Unfortunately, our attempts to supply and satisfy these needs in the educational, social, political, economic, industrial, religious, and other spheres have proved up to now more or less of a failure, and this is due in a great measure to the fact that our efforts on a subconscious basis have been directed chiefly to evolving methods of teaching, treatment, conduct, guidance, and control to meet the demands of the mass, instead of making the primary application of the principle or principles involved an individual application on a conscious basis. The foregoing leads us to a consideration of plans for human development and endeavor on the conscious and subconscious planes of life, and of the relative possibilities for advancement on each of these planes. On the subconscious plane, the orthodox plan has been, and still is, to attempt to eradicate physical defects and peculiarities by means of physical culture, exercises, etc., mental shortcomings and idiosyncrasies by means of the different cults for mental training, specific systems for the development of memory, will, and so on. Investigation will show that the deductions concerned with the adoption of such methods were made from wrong premises, the fundamental principle of conscious guidance and control in the development and growth of the creature being ignored. Furthermore, it will be found that where quote-unquote physical and mental methods are employed, any apparent gain will be in a specific sphere and accompanied by harmful cultivated defects of which the teachers and pupils are ignorant, but which sooner or later reveal themselves and gradually become established as habits. The progress made in recent years in what is called psychological knowledge leaves no room for doubt that human beings are too often unaware of their most striking psychophysical defects, peculiarities, and tendencies, which in such cases have not risen, as we say, to the sphere of consciousness. Before we can make any real attempt to reach a satisfactory state of awareness in this connection, that is, to know ourselves, we must cultivate, in connection with our psychophysical development, an increasing use of the process of reasoning in conscious endeavor, and having reached the satisfactory standard of readjustment and coordination through the establishment of a new and reliable sensory appreciation, we must proceed to put into practice this satisfactory conscious use of the psychophysical mechanism in every act of daily life. The reader who becomes familiar with the principles of the special technique which has been evolved to meet these demands will realize that knowing oneself is part and parcel, as we say, of the process, and a knowledge which will increase and keep pace with the development in conscious psychophysical guidance and control. This knowledge should be the foundation of the act of living in all spheres, and will be so when the education and general development of children is built upon the principles of constructive conscious control. On this principle, we can continue to raise the standard of knowing oneself, and this is the surest way of raising the standard of everything else we know, and of securing satisfactory results in all spheres of learning. A friend of mine who wanted to impress me with his right to be considered an authority on up-to-date psychology admitted that he based his claim on his intimate knowledge of human history, which he had acquired by long and careful study of the works of eminent historians. This belief gave him such satisfaction that I could not find it within me to suggest to him that the real history of human endeavor, as a guide to up-to-date psychology, has not been written by the historians, in fact, that it has yet to be begun, and that one does not dare to speculate as to the date of its possible completion. When I write of human endeavor, I mean individual human endeavor in connection with individual development and growth, and therefore from any real history of human endeavor, we must eliminate the record of man's activities in wars and other spheres in which he is swayed chiefly by the herd instinct, where the example, good or bad, or the command of one person, is immediately followed by the rest as an unthinking, unintelligent, automatic mass. I am quite prepared to admit that the history of human beings in wars and other spheres of massed activity is of great interest to many people, but it is of infinitesimal interest or value, particularly where man's future is concerned, as compared with that of the individual effort of the human creature struggling daily to find a solution of the flesh and blood difficulties which directly concern his well-being. These difficulties are the natural consequences of his endeavors to adapt himself to ever-changing psychophysical conditions, and of his attempts to evolve from the uncivilized to the civilized state in accordance with his early established subconscious conceptions of educational and general development. This is equally true of the everyday development and general experiences of ordinary men and women in every sphere of human activity. For we are beset with contending and disorganizing forces in the working of the psychophysical organism of each individual, inasmuch as we are developing so-called mental processes at a rapidly increasing pace never before experienced, whilst attempting to employ them side by side with so-called physical processes, which for years have become less and less satisfactorily controlled and directed, the result being a lowering of the standard of psychophysical coordination. The long line of daily difficulties with which we are now beset is only equaled by the series of shattered hopes that have followed each subconsciously directed, specific, end-gaining attempt to bring about a solution to these difficulties. Each failure makes the meat it feeds on, and the trial-and-error method of the ape has been persistently adhered to despite the fact of its failure in most civilized spheres. I will now deal from this point of view with certain systems of education and development which hold public attention at the moment, and which were designed to meet certain difficulties and defects, and I will endeavor to show that the hopes of those concerned cannot be justified, because these systems were conceived on a specific basis, and because the processes involved in their practical application call for reliance only upon subconscious experience for direction and control. We have reached a stage in our evolution when we should refuse to consider the merits or demerits of any new system of education or development which is not built upon a conscious basis. One of these systems has been taken up in recent years by a number of people in England and America as a new and valuable form of education, but as the principles involved are simply those which were employed by the circus trainers of our grandfather's time in training horses to perform evolutions to music, and at the change of music to change the step, etc., In a discussion of general psychophysical development on a basis of reasoning control, it can be put out of court and dismissed without further comment. Another system has been hailed as a new and progressive movement, and is well known for the special claim that is made for it in connection with its value in the development of the young child's senses of sight, feeling, taste, hearing, touch, etc. An organized series of materials or educative toys provides the technique for this attempted sense cultivation, but it will be realized by anyone who has watched the classes of children at work that it is again a specific and not a general development that is aimed at in this technique. A fatal mistake when we consider the interdependence of what have been differentiated as mental and physical in the human organism. It is quite possible that a child, by using this material, may gain a certain facility in the use of its hands or a specific development, say, of the sense of touch. But if, in making the movements necessary to the particular occupation in which he is engaged, he is relying upon the guidance of an imperfect sensory appreciation in the general use of his organism, it must follow that any specific improvement in the sense of touch will be accompanied by a use of his psychophysical mechanism, which, faulty to start with, will become more and more faulty the harder he tries or the more absorbed he becomes in working subconsciously for his end. Footnote: see the chapter on concentration. End of footnote. Although a specific improvement may take place in one direction, many more serious defects in the use of his mechanism as a whole will be cultivated in the process. It has been my experience that children who have had a specialized training such as this in their early years have exhibited more than the usual number of psychophysical defects and imperfections, that their sensory appreciation has been more than usually unreliable, and anyone who has followed my argument through the earlier pages will see that this must be the case where any specific development has been sought and achieved on a subconscious basis. The interdependence of the mental and physical, and of the muscular mechanism in general in psychophysical acts, has long since been recognized in theory, and yet methods of education aiming at specific development remain the vogue. Footnote: a striking instance may be mentioned in connection with re-education. Some 40 years ago, well-known scientific men in France recognized the value of re-education and adopted forms of re-education on a specific instead of a general basis, and I am informed that this obtains even today. The principle involved has been dealt with in man's supreme inheritance, and those acquainted with the facts and arguments employed will appreciate the relative value of general as against specific development or treatment of any kind. End of footnote. As a matter of fact, in connection with this very question of the specific development of a particular sense, it is now a well-recognized fact that the sense of sight, for instance, is greatly affected by the quote-unquote muscle pulls of the organism in general, and this applies where all the senses are concerned. For many years past, we have had practical proof of the improvement that can be effected in the sense of sight of pupils who have been re-educated and coordinated on a general basis of conscious control. In every case, this improvement has followed a general improvement in the coordinated use of the whole organism. This is the point which must always be emphasized by those advocating the claims of re-education and coordination on a general as against the claims of re-education and coordination on a specific basis. The person with defective sight will have quite a number of other psychophysical defects, and re-education on a general basis must precede any attempt at specific re-education. This applies in the case of the person with defective use of the organs of speech, defective use of the arms or legs, or any other defect, peculiarity, or shortcoming. In the case of children, if they were re-educated and coordinated on a plane of conscious control, 75% of the ordinary sense imperfections and difficulties with technique would never be encountered by teachers working in educational and other spheres. It does not require any special degree of intelligence to realize the tremendous amount of time and energy that would be saved if we adopted the comprehensive and constructive principles herein involved and applied it to all forms of human development and general growth in our attempts to ensure a progressive civilization. The satisfactorily coordinated child on a plane of conscious control will be possessed of a psychophysical mechanism which will tend to function to the maximum in all spheres in accordance with the standard of coordination reached. With such conditions present, the teacher can draw from the child the very best that the particular psychophysical organism functioning adequately is capable of giving, and can also be confident of a more or less increasing improvement without the undue excitement of the fear reflexes and without undue effort. Think, on the other hand, of what will be the harmful psychophysical effects on a child beset with all the impeding factors resulting from a condition of bad coordination, if, when learning to write, for instance, it takes up its pencil to use it for the first time and holds it with strained and cramped fingers, this being the result of a harmful condition of stress and strain in the general use of the psychophysical organism. Even if the teacher does not point out directly to the child that its use of the pencil is not what it should be, the child will probably be conscious of a lack of control and of being below the ordinary standard of success with its writing. Sooner or later, however, the teacher will endeavor to improve the child's writing, and he may succeed up to a point, but it will be a very poor result as compared with the standard that might be attained if the child were first re-educated and readjusted, and thus enabled to hold the pencil without the general imperfections to which I have referred. I have already stated that I am prepared to prove that when the usual methods on a subconscious basis are employed to establish a condition or to eradicate a fault or defect, quite a number of others, often more harmful than the one in the process of eradication, are developed. At recurring stages, therefore, of our attempted progress and development, we are confronted with new and increasing difficulties calling for eradication, which we have actually cultivated in educational and other processes. I shall now point out different attempts that have been made in the educational process to counteract by specific means the retarding influences of certain peculiarities and defects, manifestations which have themselves been developed by this same educational process. A little thought will enable the reader to discern the developing complications inseparable from such a process. In fact, this process becomes operative as soon as the child goes to school, for the experiences gained at school too often lead to complications if from the beginning the child is functioning nearer to its minimum than to its maximum. The methods of training, etc., actually make for complications in consequence of the numerous specific attempts which are made to remedy the many defects or shortcomings which are recognized in the child's efforts, most of which defects, however, would not have manifested themselves if the child's psychophysical functioning had been satisfactory when it entered the school. The establishment, therefore, of this condition should be the first consideration of any sound educational plan. To attempt to educate an imperfectly coordinated child by dealing in a specific way with specific defects or shortcomings is an unreasoning process, especially when we take into consideration the important part which is played in a child's life by the process of imitation. We will now go on to consider this point. End of section 15. Section 16 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 2, Imitation. The psychophysical process called imitation would seem to be one that is operative in most people to a high degree as compared with other fundamental processes. We are all aware of this aptitude, as we call it, in our fellow beings, and subconscious imitation of the characteristics of others is a factor which plays a great part in the development and growth, and also in the use of our individual psychophysical selves. Overwhelming proof is forthcoming in regard not only to the natural aptitude and subconscious inclination to imitate, but also in regard to the harmful consequences which may result from imitation. And we will now consider some of the chief factors responsible for the disappointing results accruing from the exercise of this natural aptitude in civilization. This book deals with the defects, peculiarities, imperfect uses, etc., of the human psychophysical organism. Furthermore, it is herein contended that the majority of people are more or less beset with these shortcomings, whilst in a certain number these shortcomings are so extreme that they may be said to constitute a condition of deformity in the human creature. Herein lies the cause of the disappointing and harmful results which follow imitation. For the process of imitation remains inoperative unless there is something striking to be imitated, and the chief stimulus to imitation comes from our perception, subconscious or conscious, of some characteristic or striking manifestations of another human creature, and such manifestations are, as a rule, the manifestations of psychophysical defects or peculiarities. In all spheres of present-day life, the dangers from the individual imitation of others' defects or peculiarities are very great, and it is therefore of the utmost importance that these dangers should be eliminated, or at least minimized, in all our activities in learning or learning to do, particularly where people are associated as teachers and pupils, as for instance in schools and gymnasiums. In fact, wherever teachers and pupils are in that close contact which makes possible the operation of the process of imitation. Most children at school manifest defects in the use of themselves in the ordinary acts of life, in a large number of cases very serious defects, and all kinds of drills and remedial exercises are employed in the attempt to eradicate these defects. Yet, except in very rare instances, the teachers employed in these remedial and other spheres in our schools are too often themselves beset with exaggerated forms of the same or other defects or peculiarities. If teachers are worthy of the name, it is certain that their pupils will be influenced by them in more ways than one, and that most pupils will tend subconsciously to imitate them. Now, as has already been pointed out, the most striking manifestations of these teachers will prove the most potent stimuli to the pupils' processes of imitation. Such manifestations, for instance, as peculiarities in the quality of a voice, in the manner of opening the mouth, of using the arms, or in defective utterance, vocal production, or use of the different parts of the organism in standing, walking, sitting, etc. In fact, all defects or peculiarities manifested as striking characteristics of the teachers will be found to be the most potent stimuli to the pupil's aptitude for imitation. A realization of the serious consequences involved in the foregoing will bring conviction that all teachers who manifest defects and peculiarities which are the result of their own unreliable sensory appreciation and unsatisfactory use of their psychophysical organism are a bad example, indeed a positive danger to their pupils, and that the possibility of satisfactory psychophysical results accruing to both pupil and teacher is seriously minimized by this impeding factor, viz., the acquisition of defects and peculiarities by imitation. In any sphere of learning on a subconscious basis, we have to face the fact that pupil and teacher are imbued with the erroneous idea that the pupil, by observing the teacher doing something successfully, will be able to copy it and succeed also. The pupil is quite convinced as to this, and the teacher is certain that if he teaches the pupil to do as he, the teacher, believes he does himself, he will succeed in enabling the pupil to succeed. Footnote. Take the case of a singer who, in consequence of throat trouble, is forced to retire from the public platform and become a teacher of singing. I can recall 2 such instances, in which singers were forced to retire through this cause, and having listened to their vocal efforts on several occasions prior to their retirement, one did not need to be a prophet to be sure that this would happen. For no human throat and accessories could withstand indefinitely the abuse to which they were subjected in the matter of strain and larynx displacement and chest and abdominal distortion through the imperfect use of the psychophysical mechanisms upon the satisfactory use of which depends the normal condition of the specific parts named. When these same people took up teaching, they at once proceeded to impart to their pupils, as far as they were able, the methods of singing or breathing in which they themselves believed. We can only suppose that they believed their methods were correct ones, because they were the ones they had themselves adapted during their days of learning to sing, and had continued to practice up to the time that they took up teaching, and that the fact that they had both lost their voices by remaining faithful to these very methods had not even reached their consciousness. Otherwise, how could they have ventured to try and pass on to others the methods that had been the cause of so much injury to themselves? The power of the human creature to hypnotize himself is nowhere more apparent than in such instances of human idiosyncrasy as this. End of footnote. Yet most of us are aware that if a pupil in some art is sent to watch a great artist, as is so often done, in order that he may learn something which will assist him in his particular art, the pupil is almost invariably more impressed by some characteristics of the artist that may be classed as faults than by his quote-unquote better parts. These characteristics are seized upon by the pupil as factors essential to his own improvement in performance, but experience constantly proves this belief to be mistaken. In the first place, the characteristics may be faults which the genius of the particular artist enables him to defy. It is possible that the artist succeeds in spite of them rather than because of them. Footnote. Unfortunately, this tendency may be noticed in all spheres of learning. Take the point in connection with games, for instance. S. H. Smith indulged in a crouch and whirlwind drive. Gore was noted for his forehand drive, Doherty for his use of the unchanged grip, and so on. These characteristics have been imitated by other players with the idea of improving their own game, but again experience has constantly proved this idea to be mistaken, and for the reasons given above. End of footnote. But even if the characteristics seized upon by the pupil for imitation were of value, the only way by which the pupil could make practical use of them would be, firstly, by a study of the general employment of the organism of the person to be imitated, of which the characteristics named are but special manifestations, and secondly, by being himself re-educated so as to be able to command the same general use of the organism for good or ill, according to the standard of such use as that enjoyed by the expert he tries to copy. End of section 16. Section 17 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 3. Concentration and the Sustained, Continuous Projection of Orders. A consideration of the experiences outlined in the last chapter in connection with the conscious use of the process of imitation leaves little doubt that this conception of employment of imitation involves specific attempts to gain an end. In other words, specific manifestations are selected for specific imitation, and thus the process of imitation becomes one of fixating on specific points or objects, that is, of what is known as concentration. This conception of concentration is a disastrous and narrowing one, if we may judge by the use of the word as revealed in practice, and by the harmful manifestations which follow the intention of a person to quote-unquote concentrate. These harmful manifestations, becoming more and more exaggerated, according to the degree with which the teacher finds it necessary to urge the pupil to develop this doubtful acquisition. Whence came this idea of concentration? At what stage in the process of education was it considered necessary? There can be little doubt that the conception and use of concentration sprang from a desire for the ease, spontaneity, and healthy enjoyment associated with that use of the organism which is considered a successful one, and which is characteristic of people who are said to give their attention to whatever they wish to do. What has not been realized in this connection, however, is that only those children whose psychophysical organisms are functioning imperfectly and inadequately manifest such symptoms of mind-wandering as lack of spontaneity, of observation, of curiosity, etc., granted, of course, a reasonable approach by the teacher. There can be little doubt that the child of, say, 200 years ago was born with comparatively reliable instincts, adequate respiratory need, and all the necessary psychophysical equipment which would have made for satisfactory development if the educational process adopted had been on a plane of conscious control, that is, worked out on the principle of the means whereby. Unfortunately, it was worked out on a subconscious basis, that is, on the end-gaining principle, and the harmful effects of the employment of this end-gaining principle grew very rapidly until, at a certain stage in the educational process, the child exhibited, among other shortcomings, a lack of attention, or, as they say, mind-wandering. When this shortcoming, called mind-wandering, increased to the extent that it called for a remedy, what was more natural than that the educational experts, subconsciously directed and controlled and dominated therefore by the end-gaining principle, should attempt to counteract it by some idea which would, quote-unquote, hold the mind, attention, to one subject or to one plan. Footnote. The recognition of the defect of mind-wandering and the remedy adopted for it has its parallel in the first recognition of, quote-unquote, physical deterioration and the remedy applied. The false principle underlying both remedies is the same. End of footnote. The word concentrate, according to the student's English dictionary, means to force or cause to move to a common center, to bring to bear on one object, the latter being the general acceptance of the word. Here then was the remedy. As we all know, it has been applied for many, many years, and today it makes a universal appeal in accordance with a universal belief in what the particular person conceives of as concentration. Make a search for a person who does not believe in concentration, and the results of your investigation will convince you of the truth of the foregoing statement. Introduce the subject to a friend, and for the sake of argument tell him that you do not believe in concentration, that in fact you believe the practice to be harmful in its effects. You will almost certainly be met with such remarks as, "But surely we should concentrate our minds on what we're doing. How can we keep our minds on what we are doing unless we concentrate? One is naturally anxious to do one's best, and surely one's degree of success depends upon one's power of concentration," and so on. Again, people will tell you that they cannot work successfully except in perfect quiet, and that any interruption breaks the train of thought, and many other points will be brought forward to support the speaker's belief in concentration. There is only one satisfactory way to end such arguments as this. The teacher who has worked on a basis of conscious control employs psychophysical demonstration in his attempts to convince, and in this particular sphere we are prepared to convince anyone who can and will trust his or her eyes during such a demonstration. Statements and arguments in connection with psychophysical activities should not be accepted unless the persons making them can give a practical demonstration of their truth, whilst evidencing at the same time that they themselves are in communication with their reasoning. By way of proof by demonstration, then, note the psychophysical manifestations of the person who believes in concentration during the acts of reading, writing, thinking, or during the performance of any other of the numerous daily activities. First observe the strained expression of the eyes, an expression of anxiety and uneasiness denoting unduly excited fear reflexes. In some cases, the eyes may be distorted, and the whole expression one that is recognized as the self-hypnotic stare. Then turn your attention to the general expression of the face, and pass on to the manifestations of the body and limbs. You will notice that there is an undue and harmful degree of tension throughout the whole organism. How could it be otherwise when the subject, instead of consciously reasoning out the cause or causes which has tended to develop his defect, is making a subconscious effort on the method of trial and error to overpower one set of imperfect so-called mental projections and physical tensions by a still more powerful set? For example, suppose a person is in the habit of performing a certain act, the act of sitting in a chair, for instance, with a great deal of unnecessary tension, and suppose his teacher points this out to him and reasons out with him the means whereby the act can be performed without this unnecessary strain, giving him the necessary directions, series of orders, to this end, and the reliable sensory appreciation which the satisfactory carrying out of the orders demands. Suppose further that the pupil, instead of following these directions quite simply in the order in which they are given to him, starts, as he calls it, to concentrate upon them. What will he really be doing? In a specific way, he will be concentrating upon one order and comparatively neglecting the others, whilst in a general way he will be overpowering the new set of conscious orders which he is asked to give in connection with the act of sitting in a chair by a still more powerful set of orders which are in accordance with his conception of the requirements of the acts of concentration. This last proceeding being an unreasoned one on his part, all he accomplishes by it is to reinforce all the old misdirected activities subconsciously connected with the act of sitting down, whilst the new reasoned directions concerned with the acts go by the board. He sets up what I have described elsewhere as a state of civil war within the organism, with the greatly added tension and strain that always accompanies this condition. The point is most clearly brought out in the case of the pupil who is asked to sit quietly and do nothing whilst the teacher moves some part of his body for him. In my experience, as soon as the pupil is asked not to do anything, he will immediately show all those signs of strain and fixity of attention that he shows when he is asked to do something, and which we have learned to associate with any attempt at concentration. Point this out to the pupil, and he will answer 9 times out of 10, "I am trying to do nothing." He actually believes that he has something to do nothing. To such a point can we be led by our belief in concentration. This whole matter is most instructive, as showing the danger of applying a specific remedy to a psychophysical defect like mind-wandering, which has its basis in an imperfect use of the psychophysical mechanism in general. When a person has developed mind-wandering, there is present a condition of unreliable sensory appreciation and that undue stress and strain during psychophysical activities which is always associated with imperfect coordination. To a subject in this condition, any attempt to supply a specific remedy is fraught with danger. On a plane of conscious control, such dangers can be escaped, but practically never on a subconscious basis. Now, as to the narrowing effect of so-called concentration. Those who are fortunate or unfortunate enough to undertake to act as teachers are well aware of the difficulty of finding an adult who can, as we say, think of more than one thing at a time, or perform satisfactorily any evolution requiring the coordinated use of even 2 parts of the organism. Coordinated use of the different parts during any evolution goes for the continuous conscious projection of orders to the different parts involved, the primary order concerned with the guidance and control of the primary part of the act being continued, whilst the orders connected with the secondary part of the movement are projected, and so on, however many orders are required, the number of these depending upon the demands of the processes concerned with a particular movement. Ordinarily, in attempts to use two or more parts in remedial work, the primary projection ends with the correct or incorrect use of the parts concerned with the primary movement. This applies to all other projections concerned with other parts of the movement, and is another instance of concentrated effort connected with a procedure based on the end-gaining principle. The projection of continued conscious orders, on the other hand, calls for a broad reasoning attitude, so that the subject has not only a clear conception of the orders essential, means whereby, for the correct performance of a particular movement, but can also project these orders in their right relationship to one another, the coordinated series of orders resulting in a coordinated use of the organism. It follows that an imperfectly coordinated use of the human organism is not associated with the broad reasoning attitude and the accruing benefits just indicated. And as most people have developed a more or less imperfectly coordinated use of the mechanism which involves reliance upon the end-gaining principle, it is not surprising that so many pupils have the habit of projecting unconsidered and disconnected orders, that is, that have not been reasoned out from the point of view of the coordinated use of the different parts concerned, and which therefore result in a mal-coordinated movement. When therefore such a pupil comes for remedial work on a plane of conscious control and is asked to project a series of connected orders continuously, he naturally finds great difficulty in breaking the habit he has formed of discontinuous attention and of haphazard and subconscious guidance and direction. In fact, it will be found that, as a rule, a pupil has no conception of linking up the different parts of the movement and the orders relating to these. He may, as I say, give the primary orders or directions required for the first part of the movement, but as soon as that point is reached, he no longer attempts to carry on the primary order in association with that required for the secondary part of the movement, although the essential connection between these two parts may be pointed out to him over and over again. The chief reason is that he believes that he cannot bring his mind to bear on more than one point at a time. As he expresses it, "I cannot think of so many things at once." This is entirely in line with the definition of concentration given above, but it represents a delusion on his part, because of course he has been bringing his mind to bear on several things at once subconsciously all his life, else he could not have carried out the simplest of his daily activities. A simple illustration will make this clear. Suppose a person who has been sitting down rises to speak to a friend who comes into the room. The stimulus to rise from the sitting position comes to him, and his response to this is his decision to stand up. Immediately this decision is made, the orders connected with the well-established habit of rising from the sitting to the standing position are projected to the psychophysical mechanisms involved, and the act of rising is performed, ending in the assumption of what is called the standing position. Suppose further that this person engages at once in an ordinary conversation or a scientific discussion with his friend for, say, half an hour. As far as our subject is concerned, he is absorbed by the requirements of the discussion. In fact, he will tell you that he must concentrate on the matter of the discussion in order to do his best. The point of interest for us is the consideration of the means whereby he remains standing, and of which he is not and never has been conscious. We have already referred to the projections which were associated with his decision to stand up, and these projections must be sustained until he makes a different decision, as for instance to move to some other position. It will be clear, therefore, that during the process of subconscious development, the human creature has also developed the ability to sustain continuous projections of orders. Insistence, therefore, on the necessity and importance of sustained projections in the work of coordination and re-education is based not on a new, but on a very old and fundamental principle in human development. The point of interest in all these considerations lies in the fact that this prevalent belief in concentration goes hand in hand with the acceptance of the end-gaining principle, as against the principle of thinking out clearly and connectedly the means whereby an end can be secured, and of bringing the mind to bear on as many subjects, continuous projections of orders, as is necessary for the purpose. The whole psychophysical tendency of the person who believes that concentration is essential to success and adopts and develops it as a practice in his efforts in different spheres of activity is to bring the mind to bear on one object. This exactly fits the end-gaining principle, and is antagonistic to the means whereby principle, which calls for the ability to bring to bear on a dozen or more objects if necessary, and which implies a number of things all going on and converging to a common consequence, continuous projection of orders. In the sphere of everyday life, it will be found that in the opinion of 99 persons out of 100, the consideration of means whereby, in connection with the use of the psychophysical self, will prove a hindrance or an interference. These people are confident that they cannot attend to two things at once, that is, to themselves and to their work, business, or profession at the same time. It never seems to occur to them that their psychophysical self is the instrument or machine by means of which they carry on their business or profession, and that their standard of success, therefore, in this sphere of their business or professional activity, will be in accordance with the standard of functioning of this instrument or machine. This instrument or machine being the means whereby they will be able to carry on their business or profession successfully, it follows that due attention to the functioning of this instrument or machine is essential to the due and satisfactory attention to their business or profession. The confession, therefore, that they are incapable of carrying on hand in hand, as it were, these two all-important and interdependent psychophysical processes is tantamount to an admission that due attention to the means whereby they can gain their ends will render them unable to attend to these ends, which is absurd. Such a confession, indeed, fixes the stage in the evolutionary plane where mankind as a mass stands today. It certainly is not a very high stage when we take into consideration the potentialities of the human creature and the fact that in the development of the animal and the savage, the two processes concerned with the use of the creature's self and the use of that self in the activities of life were interdependent. In a world where the ordinary person not only believes in but practices what is called concentration, the conception of the word itself and of its practical application will be in accordance with the psychophysical defects of the individual concerned, who, on becoming conscious of certain defects, believes that what he understands as concentration will remove them. Once he has adopted this narrowing process, it is not surprising that he finds it impossible to do or think of more than one thing at a time. The harmful psychophysical condition thus established does not make for a satisfactory condition of all-round functioning. On the other hand, those of us who have watched the progress of pupils who have been re-educated on a general basis have had conclusive proof that it is possible for a person to learn to give due attention continuously to, i.e., to keep the mind on the means whereby of the satisfactory use of the psychophysical mechanisms, whilst employing these mechanisms in the round of daily life, whether this be a business or professional life or any other, and with the desirable result of a continuous development in general psychophysical health. The human machine is capable of doing many things at the same time, and in those cases where a condition of unified psychophysical coordination is operative, a condition in which the process of true concentration is present, the subject is as unaware of the operation of the process of concentration as he is of that of the process of coordination. As a matter of fact, it is unlikely that such a person will have given thought to the necessity for concentration. He will not have recognized the need for it, and this being so, he will not have considered it in the light of a process requiring special attention in its application. The satisfactory conditions for coordination and the manifestations of the coordinated creature to which I have referred represent a form of concentration which cannot be secured by thinking of concentration, or by telling another to think of it, which also means that one cannot be concentrated in that sense of the word. This whole book is devoted to the exposure of the fallacy of asking any imperfectly coordinated person to attempt to eradicate a defect or peculiarity by some written word or spoken instructions. It is certain that any person who fails to concentrate, in the sense of giving due attention to the matter in hand, is an imperfectly coordinated person. To ask such a person to overcome his failure to concentrate by concentrating, or by learning to concentrate in accordance with his conception of these acts, is to cause a harmful and artificial division of personality. What is needed is the restoration of a satisfactory condition of psychophysical coordination on a general basis, which will involve the use of the true processes of concentration. End of section 17. Section 18 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 4, Memory and Feeling. Teachers in most schools today, if we are to judge by the opinions they express, are fully awake to the growing lack of attention on the part of the children. They seem to be unusually disturbed by this lack of attention, that the children, as they say, cannot concentrate. But they do not seem to be so disturbed by the increase in what is called loss of memory. Possibly they are not yet as aware of it as they should be. Be this as it may, there can be little doubt that these teachers are not aware of the fact that learning to concentrate and the subsequent psychophysical efforts in connection with the act of concentrating tend to interfere with the processes of remembering, taking this word in its broadest sense, with the result that unequal, narrowing, and often inadequate impressions are registered. Many people nowadays acknowledge their growing, quote-unquote, loss of memory, and many attempts are being made by means of memory systems, courses of mental training, etc., to help educated people to make good a certain loss in this connection. Here again, the point of interest for us lies in the fact that all these systems are based on the end-gaining principle, and that no attempt has been made in any of them, any more than in the case of mind-wandering, to associate the particular defective manifestation, in this case bad memory, with other psychophysical defects which will be found to be associated with it. At a stage of our development when what we call loss of memory is more or less a general defect, it behooves us to consider the psychophysical conditions involved and also the various imperfect uses of the psychophysical mechanisms which make for the development of these conditions. Memory is the impression which is registered as the result of some stimulus or stimuli. The lasting quality of the impression depends upon certain psychophysical processes concerned with registering impressions, and the effectiveness of these processes in their turn upon the general psychophysical condition, and especially upon the standard of sensory appreciation present in the particular case. Environment also influences these conditions in accordance with the standard of psychophysical functioning present at the time of the registration of the impression, whilst the further factor in the case is the degree of ability possessed by the individual concerned to link up the knowledge or the experience conveyed by a given stimulus or stimuli with the knowledge and experiences already acquired. As we are aware, our habits of life are the manifestations of our psychophysical functioning, and this functioning governs our habits in the matter of registering impressions in connection with memory, just as it influences all our other activities. There can be little doubt that the growing habit of newspaper reading and light literature, and the accompanying decline in the reading of books or matter which is to be retained as valuable knowledge, has been accompanied by harmful psychophysical habits which today are seriously affecting the human memory in a more or less degree in accordance with the standard of psychophysical functioning of the individual concerned. People study and commit to memory printed matter contained in certain books because this means they hope to acquire lasting knowledge. As a rule, they merely read hastily the printed matter in newspapers, magazines, etc., without making any attempt to memorize it. In the same way, they simply glance at the news of the day and register only the faintest impression. This probably serves them for a day or a week, but in a month's time they will probably be hazy about it, and in a year's time the impression may be completely effaced. This habit of taking faint impressions in reading is repeated daily by millions of people who rarely read a book in the way of study, a form of reading which would make for the registering of definite and lasting impressions. Quote-unquote skimming, that is, receiving only faint impressions of what is read, is a harmful habit which, if indulged in, rapidly becomes established, and very soon the person concerned is aware of a growing loss of memory in all spheres. We're all aware that what we term loss of memory is a more or less general defect in the process of remembering and recalling knowledge, which has become more and more marked during the past 20 or 30 years. And it would seem that, like insanity and other besetting evils, it is a defect which, unless checked in time, must undermine the usefulness of our psychophysical processes. For reasoning is dependent upon the association of remembered facts with other facts, which are the stimulus or stimuli to the processes concerned. Hence, when the memory fails, the process of satisfactory reasoning will be suspended. As we are to deal with the effects of certain sensory habits in connection with memory, it will be useful to consider the interdependence in the action and reaction of sensory appreciation and so-called mental activity. The idea conveyed by the voice of one person reaches the consciousness of another through the sense of hearing, the written word through the sense of sight. Then we have all the stimuli received through the senses of touch, feeling, taste, smell, etc. In a general way, it will be seen that our senses play the leading part in all the processes of remembering and reasoning, in fact, in the great round of psychophysical activity. The standard of functioning in the foregoing processes of reasoning and remembering depends, therefore, directly or indirectly upon the standard of functioning of sensory appreciation. My readers may, of course, point to instances of remarkable feats of memory performed by people in specific spheres, but the writer's experience of these cases is that excellence in one sphere will be found to be equaled by a lack of it in all others. In fact, the cases to which I refer are simply abnormal. One of the most interesting in my experience was that of a young man whose abnormality was manifested in dealing with timetables and the like. If you asked him to look up a train to a particular place at, say, 3 o'clock, he would turn up the page, look for the particular train by running his eyes up and down the list of times of departures, and during this apparently cursory glance at the timetable, he would memorize the whole list. 3 months later, if you asked him to name the trains in the list departing between any 2 hours you liked to name, you would be certain to receive a correct answer. But the same young man would continually leave his umbrella in the bus, go out to purchase some ordinary article for domestic use, and forgetting what he had gone to fetch, return without it. In fact, in the general way of life, and judged by the ordinary standard of human intelligence, he was quite a hopeless person. We have here a fine instance of a remarkable feat of memory in a specific sphere, accompanied by defective remembering and reasoning in general activity, a condition which, as I am able to state in consequence of personal acquaintance, was in this case associated with delusive sensory appreciation. Footnote: I should like to urge here that we must beware of placing an exaggerated value upon intelligence which manifests itself only in some specific sphere. Judgment must always be made upon the human creature's intelligence activities on a general basis in the process of living and all-round usefulness. The genuine specialist, for instance, must always be primarily a proficient general practitioner in the sphere of trade, profession, or general activity, for satisfactory growth as a specialist demands a continuous growth and development of those experiences which only the general practitioner can command. This important matter of correct relative values is one of utmost importance, and if we are to establish a sound basis for judgment in the future, we must first give consideration to the means whereby of the act rather than the act itself. What useful part does the performance of an act play in a man's so-called intellectual or physical development if the man is injured thereby? End of footnote. There is little doubt that most of the early bad habits, which result in what we call loss of memory, are actually cultivated during the different processes in all forms of education. This cultivation is most marked in those teaching processes where the pupil is called upon to perform some physical acts. Therefore, now that we have been unreasoning enough to force every unfortunate schoolchild, irrespective of his individual standard of sensory appreciation, to learn physical drill or to perform exercises, we must expect among the majority a more rapid development of loss of memory than during the previous years. As the writer is prepared to demonstrate the truth of these statements before any scientific or intelligent body of men and women, he has decided to take his illustration from this sphere of teaching. If the reader takes the trouble to be present in the school or gymnasium, or during any outdoor teaching in connection with exercises, drills, or games, he will note, if he observes carefully, that each of the children or adults is occupied chiefly in endeavoring to learn the teacher's instructions by the physical performance of some small part of these instructions which especially appeal to him, and is so concentrated and absorbed in this part of the performance that he is oblivious to any other part of the instructions that are being given by the teacher. He will only have to question the pupil to find that this is true. An expert in psychophysical re-education has only to observe the expression in the pupil's eyes and certain other manifestations to be quite certain. The following is an incident in this connection which occurred recently during a lesson in re-education in the writer's own experience. The pupil was asked to listen to certain simple instructions which involved the use of the lips, tongue, and jaw in the order named. Of course, the necessary work in regard to the general coordinated use of the organism during such teaching had already been given. The first time the instructions were given, it was obvious that before the teacher had finished speaking, the pupil was trying to memorize them as they were given by a physical sensory process, i.e., by trying to feel the instructions as they were spoken, rather than to acquire them by a process of remembering, committing to memory, as we say. The pupil was again asked to listen to the instructions and not attempt to make any movements of the parts concerned. He was asked merely to concern himself with the process of remembering the instructions. Before the instructions had been given to him a second time, however, the pupil was again very busily engaged in making certain movements of the neck, lips, and jaw. He was then asked why he was making these movements. He promptly answered, "I am trying to make certain of the instructions." It was then explained to him that the method he was pursuing was not the correct and satisfactory way of making certain of instructions, that instead the instructions should first be memorized, and that only when this had been done would there be any chance of his carrying them out in the psychophysical sphere, and then only provided that the instructions included the correct means whereby the act was to be performed. Spoken instructions reach our consciousness through the sense of hearing, written instructions through the sense of sight, the resulting action and reaction being influenced by the standard of general psychophysical functioning of the organism. But as the standard of psychophysical functioning in an ordinary child or adult of our time is inadequate, the creature is brought within a danger zone directly he attempts to carry out any activities which call for new psychophysical experiences. In a very large number of cases, the standard of this functioning has been so lowered that the individuals concerned may be said to be perpetually within this danger zone, for their guiding sensations are unreliable and often harmfully delusive. It is quite conceivable that any stimulus, as it is conveyed by sensory appreciation to the consciousness, is influenced by the psychophysical conditions present, and there is not the least doubt as to this influence and the reaction which follows. We are all aware of the different reactions of different people to the same stimulus or stimuli. Now, where the psychophysical conditions are such as we find associated with unreliable, defective, or delusive guiding sensations, sensory appreciation, we cannot surely expect a proper standard of psychophysical functioning in the general round of so-called mental activities. Sound and comprehensive reasoning is rare in a person whose sensory appreciation is unreliable, in other words, whose kinesthesia may be said to be debauched. To return to our illustration, the facts set down serve to show that the pupil, in going to work in the way he did, was following out a preconceived plan in regard to the attempt to memorize instructions. In his conception, the act of memorizing was much more a physical than a mental act, and if in his case the psychophysical functioning had been up to that standard which commands a reliable sensory appreciation, the pupil's plan might have proved successful. And in this connection, the most interesting fact in the whole experience remains to be stated. For on the morning following the lesson, when he was asked to repeat the instructions, he said, "I can't recall them now." Here then was the proof that the pupil's preconceived plan of memorizing his instructions by trying to feel them had failed, as how could it be otherwise, considering the very imperfect sensory appreciation that he had at his command. The habit of attempting to perform an act before the directing and guiding orders concerned have been memorized is in such a case associated with an inadequate use of the processes of inhibition as compared with those of volition. Therefore, when the pupil is brought face to face with the new psychophysical experiences, his inhibitory processes are ineffective. This means that he is gradually cultivating within himself an unbalanced psychophysical condition in which the so-called mental impressions he receives during the act of learning are unduly faint and unreliable. In order to restore balance in such a case, it is necessary first to develop a conscious reasoning inhibition, prevention. To this end, the person concerned must learn to say no to every stimulus to psychophysical activity until he has taken time to consider what are the reasonable means whereby the end he desires can be achieved, and he must then repeat and memorize the orders relative to these means before employing them in guiding and directing the mechanisms essential to the particular psychophysical act to be performed. Footnote: we have recently seen the rise and fall in reputation of a system which, it was claimed, could restore failing memory and by specific means bestow mental blessings which were, however, quite beyond the most sanguine expectations of any person who still enjoyed even a temporary state of sanity or who possessed even a reasonable knowledge of the fundamentals of the psychophysical processes which are essential to satisfactory memorizing. In this particular instance, the rapid rise and fall of this system affords food for reflection in connection especially with the eulogies which the proprietors of this system published from time to time from the pens and over the names of men and women, some of whom are recognized leaders of thought in our time. It is unfortunate that we cannot call these men and women to account and force them to justify these eulogies of a system which was, after all, but a piece of mental gymnastics or series of gymnastics carried out in accordance with definite instructions which totally ignored those general psychophysical conditions of the persons concerned which were the cause or causes of the mental shortcomings and of which these leaders of thought were themselves totally ignorant. The blind continue to lead the blind in the 20th century as in the days of the cavemen, but the process brings with it more disastrous results in our time than was possible in those early days of man's more limited spheres of psychophysical activities. End of footnote. End of section 18. Section 19 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 5, Complexity and Complications in Relation to Stress and Strain. Very frequently we are told that the cause of most of our difficulties is the increasing complexity of the demands of living in the present stage of civilization. It is much more to the point to say that our real difficulties arise from the almost universal adoption in practical life of the lowly evolved and gaining principle in our attempts to meet these demands, the result being that we cultivate within ourselves a condition of stress and strain, which in our ignorance we look upon as something apart from ourselves, in a subconscious, unintelligent effort to adapt ourselves to the ever-changing environments of what we designate as an advancing civilization. First, we have stress and strain within ourselves, that is, in the functioning of the psychophysical mechanisms as we employ them to satisfy the needs of the organism in the maintenance of health conditions and in general activity. The errors and defects in the sphere of psychomechanics indicated by the foregoing are the result of the dependence upon unsound and misleading principles concerned with our individual development and growth. Then we have the stress and strain of what we so often describe as the fight for life, the complexity of life, and so on. In other words, the stress and strain occasioned by our endeavor to make the wheels of the complex man-made machinery of life go round in social, industrial, political, educational, religious, and moral spheres. These two spheres of stress and strain, which we have indicated, must always be considered as inseparable, seeing that our social, educational, industrial, political, religious, and moral life depends for its being on the experiences of our individual psychophysical life. The false principles which are applied to the act of living in both instances are entirely responsible for these harmful conditions of strain and for the unsettled state which holds sway at this very moment. Had the prophets, philosophers, and leaders of the past recognized this fact, they would have shown proof of clear analysis and foresight. That they did not do so is most unfortunate, and to this fact we may attribute the growing tendency towards disunion instead of unity, towards dissatisfaction instead of satisfaction, towards enmity and discord instead of good fellowship and peace, the sum total of these present conditions constituting an unsatisfactory instead of a satisfactory stage in human evolution. We have unrest everywhere, unrest in men, women, and children, which is attributed to quote-unquote nerves or some such symptom, and the alarming feature of it all is that it is an increasing unrest. The venomous and penetrating roots of the cancer of disunion continue to spread and have already caused to deteriorate and in many instances have actually demoralized the vital parts of our psychomechanical life, as well as our social and industrial life, and the difficulties in application of the principles which make for unity are already alarming. It is universally contended that we need unity in all spheres, and we are all familiar with the cry, "United we stand, divided we fall," and this has a universal application to satisfactory human endeavor. Yet in almost every sphere of human activity, in religion, in education, in the social plan, in politics, in trades unionism, etc., we find a growing tendency to disunion. Review the history of human endeavor during the past few hundred years, and consider the cause or causes of the increase in the number of different sects in the sphere of religion, in the number of different systems of education, social reform, in the number of political parties, and probably most striking of all, in the increase in the tendency to adopt, under the banner of trades unionism, measures and principles which impede unity. Surely it is fair to conclude that the cause or causes of the growing disunion in all these spheres is due to some serious defect or defects in the fundamentals of these man-made institutions. If the principles involved had been sound, their application would have tended towards unity, and the fact that the people immediately concerned failed to remain in agreement as to the relative value of the principles they had decided to apply is surely an admission of their unsoundness. Be that as it may, we cannot fail to recognize the important fact that an alarming growth of disunion leading to complications in human activity is herein indicated, and complications are ever associated with misdirected activity. If we keep to our present system of life, living will be still more complicated in 100 years from now, and so on, until possibly such a degree of complication will be reached that we shall not even have time to live. The foregoing serves to indicate that the unreasoned processes which lead to harmful complications in the educational sphere are paramount in every other sphere of life. The parallel to the failure in our teaching methods is to be found in our attempts to progress in social, political, industrial, religious, and other spheres, where the remedy is often more harmful than the disease. How absurd, for instance, are the attempts for the quote-unquote uplifting of man in the industrial sphere, when these are associated with that demoralizing conception which has led to the lowering of the standard of man's daily efforts to that of the less capable, and so to the lowering of the standard of individual psychophysical functioning in a sphere of labor. We are all aware of the psychophysical effect of giving our best in our daily labors, and there is little hope for the person who is no longer able to gain satisfaction and happiness from this source. Again, in the sphere of politics, what can be more stupid than the ordinary party attitude, leading as it does to undesirable individual manifestations of deception, prejudice, egotism, and emotional gusts? It is an unreasonable and dishonest course to withhold support from or denounce measures which one believes to be right and of value to humanity, simply because they chance to be advocated by the political party to which one does not belong. Under the present plan, politics and deception are interdependent. The individual seeking re-election will resort to forms of deception to which he would not stoop in other walks of life, particularly in the matter of making promises which he has not the least hope of fulfilling, and which his electors, if they use their reasoning powers, would often know he cannot fulfill. They are still at a stage of evolution where reasoning is dominated by the herd instinct, and so they are carried away by his oratory or personality or both. The harmful effects of the activities of individuals beset with serious and often abnormal psychophysical defects are present in every sphere of life, and we have to face the fact that it is not the people who are out to do harm to their fellow beings who are setting back the clock of civilization today, but, on the contrary, those misguided people who are devoting themselves to the uplifting of their fellow men, whilst remaining themselves under the influence of perverted emotions and prejudices. The history of our social plan in the spheres of industrialism, politics, religion, education, medicine, etc. for the past 300 years is of the greatest interest in this matter of the attitude of those concerned with attempts at reform, organization, advancement, and unity, for these attempts will invariably be found to be specific and end-gaining attempts, resulting, even where the specific end is gained, in new complications leading to social conflict and harmful diversity. If we are to check the present overbalancing in these directions and to advance satisfactorily, we must gradually raise the standard of individual psychomechanical coordination and pass to a stage of constructive conscious control which would be associated with the establishment of means whereby principles instead of end-gaining principles. End of section 19. Section 20 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4. Sensory Appreciation and its Relation to Happiness. The characteristic note of true happiness is struck when the healthy child is busily engaged in doing something which interests it. It may be the little girl washing and wiping her teacups, or dressing and undressing her doll, or the little boy setting to work to make a toy train or cart with the aid of a piece of wood and a string, or piecing together some modern toy which, when completed, will be a house or a bridge or a working model of some machine. The child is always attracted by machinery. Indeed, to find out how it works is the natural desire of every healthy child, and it is therefore very significant that in schools where experiments have been made in re-education on a general basis, the children have become more interested in this work than in any other of their school activities. They are not slow to recognize that they are themselves the most interesting machines, and their natural interest in mechanics finds full scope in the process of their own re-education. Our experience has been that this interest, an intelligent interest in the working of their own psychophysical mechanisms, is one that grows steadily and comprehensively. For the psychophysical processes which precede and accompany the child's desire to acquire knowledge of the mechanical working of inanimate machinery are the same as those which are called into activity in connection with the acquisition of the knowledge of the satisfactory use of its own mechanisms. It should be obvious to all concerned that in any process of growth or development of the child or adult, experience in employing the mechanics of the psychophysical organism should precede all other mechanical experience, and that any experiences gained later in the sphere of inanimate mechanical experimentation would thus be materially increased in value. One can recall the expression of interest, happiness, and satisfaction exhibited by the child when one has enabled him to understand for the first time that his unduly stiffened neck, with perhaps his head too far pulled back, is really not the fault of his neck at all, but is due to the fact that he is trying to do with the muscles of his neck what should be done by other mechanisms. Footnote: Of course, the teacher's manipulation will have given him previously the reliable sensory appreciation in this connection. For a detailed statement, see chapter Imperfect Sensory Appreciation. End of footnote. One cannot forget either the unfamiliar but satisfactory manifestations of the child when he becomes able to inhibit, that is to say, no to some stimulus to misdirected activity, which in the case of the last illustration would be to say no to his subconscious desire to throw back his head and stiffen his neck, and then, with an expression born of confidence, to give orders or directions which are the result of a reasoned conception of his correct means whereby, the whole process tending to prevent the overexcitement of the fear reflexes. Footnote: The demeanor of the child changes when he learns to inhibit his desire to respond to a certain stimulus, before going on to give the new orders or directions which are the forerunners of the new means whereby the particular end he desires can be achieved. This change of expression was very noticeable in the case of a little girl who had developed the most pronounced bad habits in the use of her psychophysical organism, and had what we call a dour expression when her lesson started. At a certain stage in her re-education, she developed a conscious recognition of the new and correct experiences secured by the teacher's manipulation, and she became able to inhibit, i.e., to say no to the stimulus which had previously started up the whole train of movements that were incorrect and harmful. When she discovered this, viz., that by saying no to herself, she could prevent her troublesome and long-established bad habits from gaining the upper hand, her whole demeanor changed, and with a confidence that was quite new to her, she proceeded to give herself the directions which would enable her to make in the new and coordinated manner, correct means whereby, the very movement which she had stopped herself from making in her old malcoordinated manner. The fact that she could not only think out, but control the means whereby she could attain her end, instead of rushing at it blindly in her old subconscious way, robbed her of the diffidence which had been such an overdeveloped trait in her case, and with the gradual development of control, the old dour expression gave place to one of confidence and happiness. End of footnote. Experiences prove to us that children are unusually interested in the working of their own psychophysical machinery when the processes employed are concerned with re-education on a general and conscious basis. They find a new interest in all activities to which they can apply an improving use of themselves, and their happiness in finding, for instance, that they can improve their games by a conscious general direction of themselves, a very different thing from the usual specific directions they receive in coaching lessons, is a happiness which increases with their psychophysical improvements. I shall now endeavor to show that the lack of real happiness manifested by the majority of adults of today is due to the fact that they're experiencing not an improving, but a continually deteriorating use of their psychophysical selves. This is associated with those defects, imperfections, undesirable traits of character, disposition, temperament, etc., characteristic of imperfectly coordinated people struggling through life beset with certain maladjustments of the psychophysical organism, which are actually setting up conditions of irritation and pressure during both sleeping and waking hours. Whilst the maladjustments remain present, these malconditions increase day by day and week by week, and foster that unsatisfactory psychophysical state which we call unhappiness. Small wonder that under these conditions the person concerned becomes more and more irritated and unhappy. Irritation is not compatible with happiness, yet the human creature has to employ this already irritated organism in all the psychophysical activities demanded by a civilized mode of life. It stands to reason that every effort made by the human creature whose organism is already in an irritated condition must tend to make the creature still more irritated, and therefore, as time goes on, his chances of happiness diminish. Furthermore, his experiences of happiness become of ever shorter duration, until at last he is forced to take refuge in a state of unhappiness, a psychophysical condition as perverted as that state of ill health which people reach when they experience a perverted form of satisfaction in the suffering of pain, that is, in the enjoyment of bad health, as we say. This perversion links up with those purely animal traits which are apt to accompany morbid conditions, and which become unduly and harmfully manifested in those states of unusual excitement and marked depression when the individual's reasoning is in abeyance, and he is dominated by his emotional impulses. We have merely to consider the experiences of the human creature afflicted with the conditions of irritation and pressure already referred to, in his attempts to employ this irritated organism in a general way in the activities of life, to recognize that even his occasional experiences of happiness will be of unduly short duration, and will tend to become more so with the progress of time. It matters not whether these experiences are gained in the sphere of rest, work, recreation, pleasure, games, or general education. In all these activities, impeding factors such as irritation and pressure remain more or less unchanged. This means that experiences that would only tend to irritate a person in possession of a comparatively high standard of sensory appreciation and of satisfactory coordinated psychophysical mechanisms would be certain to irritate most harmfully a person who is already beset with irritation and pressure in consequence of the harmful condition of unreliable sensory appreciation in the use of the organism which we have indicated. Furthermore, such a person will be irritated by experiences which would not have the least effect upon one whose sensory appreciation is reliable. The psychophysical condition of the person afflicted with irritation and pressure is such that all his efforts in any direction will be more or less of a failure as compared with the efforts of those who are not so afflicted. And there is probably no stimulus from without which makes more for irritability of the person concerned than failure, either comparative or complete, in accomplishment. Nothing which can have a worse effect upon our emotions, self-respect, happiness, or confidence. In fact, upon our temperament and character in general. Just note the expression and general demeanor of one who is a success in life, then of one who is a failure. of one who has just succeeded in some simple act, in work, games, or learning something, than of one who has failed comparatively or completely. If we note any of these people on days when comparative success has attended their efforts, the least observant among us must be convinced of the striking influence of success and of how conductive it is to happiness. Watch the child in its earliest efforts before and during school days, or the experiences of adults in the activities of daily life in any sphere, and it will be observed that when either is employing his organism successfully, happiness and satisfaction rule supreme. Confidence is born of success, not of failure, and our processes in education and in the general art of living must be based upon principles which will enable us to make certain of the satisfactory means whereby an end may be secured, and thus to command a large percentage of those satisfactory experiences which develop confidence, as against a small percentage of those unsatisfactory experiences which tend to undermine our confidence and make us unhappy. A well-known medical specialist sent one of his patients to me for diagnosis. He then called upon me to discuss the details of my conclusions, and when I pointed out to him that his patient would be a difficult pupil to re-educate in consequence of his unusually unbalanced emotional condition and state of harmful irritability, he remarked, "I must tell you that he has been soured by comparative failure in his professional work." In order to illustrate these points, we will deal with the practical experiences of the human creature in the fields of recreation and games, because we may assume that here, at any rate, he will be acting in accordance with the dictates of his own wishes and desires, in the anticipation of those psychophysical experiences which make for happiness. We are all aware of the pleasurable anticipation and even joyous, mild excitement associated with the early experiences of our men and women friends who take up golf, tennis, cricket, football, and other games and forms of recreation. This pleasurable anticipation arises from the fact that they associate the manifestations which we call happiness with indulgence in these activities, and there can be little doubt that we should be able to command a continuance of happiness and an increasing satisfaction with the increase of our experience in any game or form of recreation, as far as our personal efforts, at any rate in the practice of the game, are concerned. But despite this fact, we know that in the great majority of cases, manifestations of happiness, contrary to expectation, tend to decrease rather than increase with the accumulation of practical experiences in these forms of recreation. That this is the case with most of us is surely proof that something is radically wrong with the use of our psychophysical mechanisms and with the application of these mechanisms to the demands of the particular game or recreation. The reason for this will be clear if we try to set down the psychophysical experiences in action and reaction which result from a person's decision to play, say, golf. Let us take the case of any ordinary person, not some person exceptionally well equipped for golf, and watch him in his first lesson with his teacher, professional or otherwise. It is safe to conclude, firstly, that this pupil's sensory appreciation is more or less unreliable and associated with an imperfectly coordinated use of his psychophysical mechanisms, and secondly, that he has never been re-educated on a general basis. Unfortunately, this applies equally to the teacher, and means that in both cases their knowledge of the use of the psychophysical mechanisms which they are about to employ in the lesson is the result of unsatisfactory and even harmful subconscious experiences. It is safe to assume that they have little conscious knowledge of the use of these mechanisms either in the field of theory or in that of practice, and even that little will be on a specific basis. The true relation of cause and effect on a general basis in connection with the working of these mechanisms will not be given due consideration, and, as we shall see, the majority of effects, symptoms of some cause or causes that they chance to recognize, will not be treated by them as such, but as causes, and dealt with in accordance with the end-gaining principle. We are all familiar, for instance, with the type of instructions which the teacher will give to the pupil in regard to holding the club, keeping his eye on the ball, and all the other things which the pupil should or should not do with the different parts of his organism at a particular time. Now, it will be clear to any spectator with a knowledge of the satisfactory employment of the psychophysical mechanisms on a general basis that a particular pupil will be psychophysically incapable of carrying out satisfactorily quite a number of the specific instructions given to enable him to meet his difficulties, and indeed that any attempt on his part to carry out these instructions on the end-gaining principle will result with practice in an increase, not in a decrease of his difficulties. It is a matter of common knowledge that the majority of players fail to keep their eyes on the ball, but neither the pupil nor the teacher is aware of the fundamental impeding psychophysical factors concerned with this failure. It is impossible within the scope of this book to discuss these factors in detail in relation to golf, and I intend instead to deal with the pupil's attempt to carry out the teacher's instruction from the standpoint of reliability of sensory appreciation and of coordination on a general basis. As a preliminary, I want to point out that in the teaching plan, of which the lesson we are watching is an example, nothing is given in the way of practical help to the pupil in these directions. The teacher is certainly unable to make a satisfactory diagnosis in the matter of reliable sensory appreciation, and probably does not know whether a pupil is well coordinated on a general basis or not. In any case, it is a fact that he does not attempt to make a diagnosis in either connection. He merely assumes that if he gives the pupil certain instruction, tells him what to do and what not to do, he has conscientiously carried out his duties as a teacher. Yet he should know perfectly well that in the course of the up and down swing of the club, for instance, quite a number of separate instructions that he has given his pupil have to be carried out by quite a number of different parts of the organism. Further, he should know that all these instructions must be linked together. That is, the pupil must be able to think of and put into practice more than one thing at a time, and that all the different parts of the organism must be employed sympathetically, must, as he would say, work together. In other words, the teacher should know that there must be coordination in the employment of all the mechanisms involved, yet he gives his pupil no means whereby he can achieve this necessary coordination on a general basis in the use of his psychophysical self. Now, we have already pointed out, and we are prepared to prove, that the great majority of people of our time are more or less imperfectly coordinated. If this is so, how is it possible for a pupil to coordinate this psychophysical organism on a general basis for the carrying out of the golf teacher's specific instructions on that first day or any subsequent day of lessons until he has been restored to a satisfactory standard of general coordination by some process of free education which will restore a reliable standard of sensory appreciation? It is clear, therefore, from the foregoing, that the pupil, whose lesson we are watching, is ill-equipped to carry out the teacher's instructions successfully, and we will now follow him through the experiences which result from the different efforts he makes to carry out these instructions in his ill-equipped condition. It will be safe to assume that after the performance of the first stroke, the teacher will have noted some particular fault or faults, to which he will draw the attention of the pupil, and it is equally safe to assume that the pupil, working on the end-gaining plan and indulging in that process which he calls concentration, will start to concentrate upon the different corrections suggested by the teacher in connection with the fault or faults pointed out to him, after which he will make another shot, i.e., try again. It will be found that in this attempt the pupil has already decided that one or other of these corrections is the all-important one, and so he will proceed to concentrate specially upon it to the practical exclusion of the others, and he will repeat this process with each subsequent attempt. Now, although it is quite possible that by this plan of concentrating on the corrections he may succeed in eradicating some specific fault or faults, The point I wish to emphasize again is that he will have gained this end at the expense of overlooking some other equally important corrections in consequence of his having concentrated upon one at a time. By this process of concentration, therefore, as we have pointed out in an earlier chapter, he will probably have added to his list of faults. Not only this, but the psychophysical process involved is inseparable from the overexcitement of the fear reflexes, and gradually builds up an emotional state which impedes the pupil's progress in the game, and becomes an established phobia which will not only influence his play harmfully, but will impede him in all his other activities. One thing is certain, that if an imperfectly coordinated person makes a subconscious effort to carry out such specific instructions as we are now dealing with, the result as a whole must be unsatisfactory. The majority of his psychophysical experiences will be harmful experiences, inasmuch as they must tend to undermine his confidence in himself, and this lack of confidence, arising from a consciousness of complete or comparative failure, will serve to add still another impeding factor to the situation, in the overexciting of the fear reflexes and the development of harmful emotional conditions which are associated with a state of comparative unhappiness. One of the greatest factors in human development is the building up of a form of confidence which comes as a result of that method of learning by which the pupil is put in possession of the correct means whereby he can attain his end before he makes any attempt to gain it. By this method, the attempt he makes will be more or less successful from the outset, and a series of satisfactory instead of unsatisfactory psychophysical experiences will follow, and with them that intelligent confidence and state of happiness associated therewith, which is the consummated conquest of the human being on a conscious plane. In a civilization such as ours, where unrest, unhappiness, and lack of interest in the real things of life are strikingly manifested by mankind, all our efforts should be to enable the human creature to retain the interest and satisfaction exhibited by the healthy child when employing his organism successfully. Further, to create conditions in which satisfactory growth, with all that this process connotes in fundamental psychophysical manifestations, will continue right on through life, and in which the stagnation which accompanies fixed psychophysical habits and specific end-gaining uses of the psychophysical organism will be impossible. Conscious employment of the psychophysical mechanisms on a basis not of a specific but of a general coordination in all the acts of living constitutes a real and never-ending intellectual problem of constructive control, which instead of destroying develops the interest and general intellectual pleasure in even such ordinary acts as those of sitting down and standing up. Take, for instance, the oft-repeated act of sitting down. In this act, the subconsciously controlled person, as soon as he touches the chair, instead of allowing it to support him, proceeds, as he would say, to sit down, that is, to make certain unnecessary movements and alterations in the adjustment and general condition of the organism, involving that imperfect use of the mechanisms which he subconsciously employs in order to seat himself, sit down. This means that he has performed the act of sitting down in accordance with his subconscious conception of it. In other words, he has slumped, as we say, and when this imperfectly coordinated condition is brought about, the process of seating himself is completed as far as his awareness is concerned. He remains oblivious to the misuse of the mechanisms involved and to the irritation and pressure associated with the harmful posture which he has subconsciously assumed and which, unfortunately for him, feels natural and comfortable. Likewise, when he stands up, he feels the way to stand up and repeats the same subconscious indulgence of his automatic habits connected with the act of standing up. And once he has stood up, the process again is completed as far as his awareness is concerned. In both instances, he ends a psychophysical process which in reality should never be finished. His standard of awareness, indeed, in such connections, is as inadequate as his sensory appreciation is unreliable, and the psychophysical conditions here indicated are inseparable from lack of interest and lack of general pleasure in the ordinary acts of life. On the other hand, when a person sits down or stands up in accordance with the demands of constructive conscious control, the process involves an adequate and continuous state of increasing awareness in regard to the use of the mechanisms, so that immediately there is a wrong use of these mechanisms, the person concerned becomes aware of it, and at once substitutes a satisfactory for the unsatisfactory use. Increasing awareness in this connection makes more and more for successful accomplishment in accordance with reasoned and satisfactory means whereby, and connotes a continuous process which introduces a special interest and pleasure into the most ordinary acts of life. Footnote: as I wrote in Man's Supreme Inheritance, when real conscious control has been obtained, a habit need never become fixed. It is not truly a habit at all, but an order or series of orders given to the subordinate controls of the body, which orders will be carried out until countermanded. End of footnote. Conscious fundamental psychophysical processes do not end. They are continuous and therefore connote real growth and development. This applies to all the acts of life, and the establishment of the psychophysical uses which are associated with the processes of constructive control and continuous growth herein involved is inseparable from that psychophysical manifestation which we call happiness. They are processes which result from the application of the means whereby principles, and not from the application of end-gaining principles associated with those specific attempts which are characteristic of human endeavor on a subconscious plane, and which are adapted in the pursuit of what we call pleasure. Here we have the explanation of the growing need among subconsciously controlled people for specific pleasure, with all its attendant shortcomings of unrest and excess, as compared with that enduring happiness with its accompanying sense of satisfaction and contentment, which is associated with moderation and general control. Unfortunately, we have been taught that all the ordinary, most necessary, and therefore most oft-repeated acts of life should be automatic and unconscious. For this reason, they have become indifferent. The psychophysical condition here indicated is one that induces stagnation in the organism, and as it is a condition which becomes more and more pronounced with advancing age, we gradually lose the capacity to take conscious interest in and derive pleasure from those normal and useful activities of life in the sphere of doing, hearing, seeing, etc. Small wonder, then, that sooner or later we seek satisfaction in less normal and less useful activities, and create an undue and harmful demand for specific excitements and stimulations or for some other specific pleasure. All our efforts in the way of education should be to create conditions in which growth will continue through life, conditions in which the stagnation which accompanies fixed habits will be impossible. We shall not then find men and women, as we do now, actually afraid to retire from the business or profession in which they have gained their livelihood and earned a competence, because they have no interest in doing anything else and cannot adapt themselves to a new way of life. This tragedy is one of the most common and most poignant features of our modern life, and it will be found that in such cases the individuals concerned have so little control over their psychophysical mechanisms except within certain limited spheres that they cannot employ them in an entirely new sphere without experiencing the most distressing forms of psychophysical functioning. A study of this question will show us that the processes of reasoning and of action in the ordinary subconsciously controlled person who has reached the age when he is about to retire from his business or professional work reveal a tendency to fall back and depend more and more upon automatic methods of procedure. By the time the greater number of men and women have reached this age, they have become mere automatons, repeating day by day the same round of psychophysical activities, and gradually limiting themselves more and more as time goes on within certain specific spheres of activity, whilst at the same time the defects and imperfections in the general use of the mechanisms upon which this activity depends become more and more pronounced. This means that with the approach of age, a condition of deterioration and stagnation is being gradually cultivated throughout the organism generally, the very worst possible preparation for the new way of life which is entailed when a man or a woman retires from his or her business or profession. This explains why so many people break down when they stop work. Footnote. One has only to note the attitude of people in general towards circumstances, even within the domestic sphere, which enforce changes in their habits of life, to realize what an exaggerated and even harmful conception they have of the sufferings or discomforts they're called on to endure on account of this disturbance of the automatic round of their domestic existence. End of footnote. Someone has said, in referring to the monotony of the environment in which the human creature lives and moves, that monotony is the deathbed of existence. But what of the monotony within the human creature's psychophysical self, a monotony caused by the gradual cessation of those sensations concerned with new experiences which have accompanied growth and mobility within the organism since birth? This is indeed monotony in its most harmful form, for it goes hand in hand with an increasing degree of stagnation throughout the whole psychophysical organism. We recognize, for instance, the danger of stagnation in our cells when the processes concerned with repair of wasted tissue cease to be operative. When this occurs, the stagnation which ensues is analogous to that which follows the cessation of sensations concerned with new experiences referred to above. Both forms of stagnation making for monotony and unhappiness. Yet another form of monotony results from quote-unquote knowing, from having grown up, from the consciousness that we have ceased to grow. When a man reaches the point where he concludes that he knows his subject, he decides consciously or subconsciously that he has nothing more to learn, and he promptly begins to lose what he does know. When he becomes aware that he has grown up, he has reached the stage where he has already begun to stultify those potentialities for growth which once were his, and which might have been his to the end. Boredom, monotony, and discontent follow swift upon the establishment of this condition. We also find that the people who are satisfied that they know are the least observant people, and at the same time the most unhappy and discontented. Most people will admit that realization too often is not equal to anticipation, but this again is in consequence of the psychophysical conditions present. If realization is not only to equal, but even sometimes to surpass anticipation, our psychophysical plan of development must be fundamentally one of continuous growth and of new experiences, and consequently we never reach the point where we may be said to finish learning. This connotes a continuous anticipation of new experiences in growth and development, so that the realization of some new experience in psychophysical functioning does not bring a sense of finality with the consequent loss of interest, but is a clear indication that a step forward has been made in growth and development, which is again a stepping stone to the next stage of advancement, and so on. The new experience is concerned with the gradually improving functioning of the human creature, indicated in the foregoing, are primarily dependent upon a growing understanding, consciously developed, of the operations concerned with the direction and control of the psychophysical organism in general during the waking and sleeping hours. William James suggested to us that we should get up every morning looking for health. We hope to go further, for we have a technique to offer in this connection which will command for the human creature an increasingly high standard of that condition of psychophysical functioning which makes for health, and the experiences resulting from the use of this technique bring conviction that the all-important duty of the human creature in our present stage of evolutionary vicissitudes is that of the continuous individual cultivation of fundamental constructive conscious control of the human psychophysical organism and its potentialities. It is true that man has made a specific application of so-called conscious control in the employment of his powers of reasoning in relation to causes and effects, means and consequences outside of the human organism. But this attempt at specific control of environment has not resulted in a really reliable control of actual consequences. Our experiences seem to show rather that the longer we continue to apply this form of unreliable conscious control, the worse off we are likely to be. My experience in connection with the practical application of the technique I have described convinces me that if we are ever to command a reliable, constructive control of environment and satisfactory reasoning in relation to causes and effects, means and consequences in this connection, we must be able primarily to command fundamental constructive conscious control of the individual psychophysical organism. This calls for a higher and higher standard of psychophysical functioning, which in turn demands a satisfactory and growing understanding and conscious use of the wonderful mechanisms concerned. This process provides the human creature with a sphere of psychophysical activity almost unlimited in its possibilities, where hitherto he has evidenced the worst forms of unreasoned and subconsciously directed activity. End of section 20. Section 21 of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Conclusions. Psychophysical attitude. In the course of this book, I have dealt with various human defects, peculiarities, shortcomings, and imperfect uses of the psychophysical organism, which tend to increase during the process of growth and development, and too often become established as bad habits long ere adolescence has been reached, the sum total of the experiences involved being the foundation of what is called mental attitude. The attitude of the human creature towards the functioning of his psychophysical self and towards the employment of this self in the activities of daily life is the be-all and end-all, and only those who possess the key to this storehouse of their psychophysical experiences, inherited or acquired, can reach that stage of understanding of their psychophysical reactions to stimuli which justifies an optimistic view of any efforts that may be made for man's uplifting. The understanding to which I refer is that understanding of the psychophysical processes present at the varying stages of the human creature's growth and development, which are responsible for manifestations, the proper understanding of which is essential to any satisfactory consideration of cause and effect, primarily in connection with activities concerned with the development of the human creature himself, and secondly, in connection with his activities outside himself when applied to the act of living in the complex round of social, religious, political, moral, educational, industrial, and other experiences in civilization. The human creature continues to rush from one extreme to another on the end-gaining principle in his attempts at reform or physical improvement, and the point just made as to what is necessary for the primary and secondary understanding of cause and effect is of the utmost importance in this connection, and in any estimate of schemes for the uplifting of the human creature that are likely to prove permanently satisfactory. What probability is there that any one of these schemes of reform will do anything but make conditions more chaotic until the individuals concerned have been re-educated on a general basis and reorganized as a psychophysical unity? For, in the last analysis, it is the creature's individual reaction to the stimuli resulting from the individual conception of that scheme of reform that matters, even if the scheme, taken by itself, might be considered a satisfactory one. This leads us back to the theme of conception which has been outlined, and in connection with which we have endeavored to show that only in a state of coordinated activity, in which the organism is functioning near its maximum, can we hope for anything approaching a satisfactory conception of new and unfamiliar ideas or experiences. Hence the necessity of having an understanding of cause and effect, primarily in connection with the functioning of the organism itself. For it is only after we have solved this problem in the individual that we can safely pass on to the secondary consideration of cause and effect in connection with the problems of everyday life. Only then shall we be justified in asserting that individual reactions to stimuli will be the reactions of a controlled human creature whose employment of the processes of reasoning in the activities of life prevents the undue and harmful excitement of the fear reflexes and emotions, especially when he is called upon to deal with those new and unfamiliar situations or problems which are the natural outcome of all processes tending towards advancement on the evolutionary plane. End of section 21. End of Constructive Conscious Control of the Individual by F. Matthias Alexander.